Hey everybody, welcome back to another Crash Course video, where I just very briefly go over how I build the decks without going in too deep, so it's pretty short. Today we're gonna take a look at USSR, which is probably the deck that varies the most between players. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, logistics, probably the easiest one. I mean, TAD UK of course stands out here, you can use that. It's a bit tough to use, but can be very strong. I've run my 1v1 deck, Commando, whatever the name is, Infantry CV, BRDM2U, and T8UK. Supply track 20 point, my favorite, and a fob. Once again, you can run the T72 if you want the cheap CVs, the BMD2 instead of the BRDM2 if you want something more survivable, as well as some sort of self-defense. Of course, the main thing is you lose speed, but viable choice. You can also use the K29 instead of the MTV. Infantry. Well, let's start with the obvious thing. VDV90. You have to have at least one card. I would recommend two, but they're just so incredibly strong, useful, and versatile. You have to run them. If you want to heal or drop, you can use them in the MTV. If I wouldn't recommend, but you can use them. Want some kind of like long range ATGM IFV, you can use the VMD3, although you have better options in Soviets. But it is an option. You can run them in the BTRD if you want them cheap and affordable. And the best card, and like one of the strongest infantry card in the game period, VDV90 in this crash at such a useful transport, base defense, offensively, flying defense. Yes. I run two cards, one in the scratch at, one in the 5-pointer. Next up, another must-have is Sapery in the BTRT. Just cheap, incredibly strong fire support, even with infantry to sponge. Always go for the Sapery and not the Sapery 85, because what you care for is the 10 HP on the infantry squad, and not the weaponry. And the Sapery 85 have only 5 HP. You can run Igla in the scratch at for some AA, and then lighten up the load in your support tab. Not doing it here, but it is a very, very viable choice. Especially if you want more support tab units for your artillery, or you just don't know what to put in for the 5th card. I next up run Morskai Pechota in a BTR 88, Morskai Pechota 90 to be exact. Not the most favorable unit in the game, not a lot of people use them anymore. I still think they're decent. They're not amazing, for 25 points, not the best AT, and not the best anti-infantry damage, although it's not too bad. But it's mainly just for, like, I would say affordable, not too expensive, but obviously not cheap. Like town fighting infantry that also comes with like a nice IFV or APC, I guess. You can also run Modus Strike in a 5-pointer. It's not an amazing spam infantry, but it's the best that USSR gets. But you don't really need it because you have such strong fire support and strong vehicles. But even if it's not the best spam infantry, it is still some sort of spam infantry, which is still useful in and of itself. AGGM wise, you can run Factoria in the 5-pointer, you can run Factoria in the MTV. I run Congress M in the BTR 70. I feel like it fits most to me, or fits the best to the deck the way I play it. But again, multiple choices you have here. Spetsnaz I would not recommend using. Regarding IFVs, Modus Strike in the BMP3 is an option. These days people mostly prefer the OBR 1986. It's also cheaper. And the whole packs more punch on the ATGM, although it obviously lacks range and speed. Support tab, one of the strongest tab, if not the strongest. Lots of stuff once again you can do here. I'm just gonna briefly show you what I do. I use a card of Tunguska M, I use a card of OSA AK, and a card of the OSA for my fast wheeled, which is basically the same thing, and the helicopter AI in the opening. I run the Urigan and I run the Potnos. Alright, this is what I do. What you can also do is you can run if you want, but I would say it's wasted points. The Mista or the Malka, but the strength in Soviet artillery lies in the MLRS. Both the Smerch and Urigan incredibly strong options. Smerch, Urigan top tier. I think this is the best option. Smerch you can run as well, or on top of that even. It's in my opinion more of a team game pick, but it's not far from useful in 1v1s, but also just kind of depends on how mobile your opponent is, what kind of deck they use. So you cannot always get amazing value out of it in a short period of time, but the Urigan is just universally so incredibly strong. Yeah. if you want to try hard, don't pass up on it. Buratino also incredibly strong. In 1 versus 1s, I would not necessarily recommend, because on wider maps, especially if you open with one, and your opponent suddenly pushes on the other side, or you need the Buratino on the other side, you have to move it over the whole map. It's relatively easy to lose if something gets line of sight on it, and then the peace run or something comes in. Yeah, in 1 versus 1s, I generally wouldn't really recommend it. As strong as it still is, but the Eurogans just does the same thing, but it's just so much more versatile. Regarding AA, Tor is valid, also AKM is valid. Bookend 1 is valid, especially if you run Scratchets, lots of Scratchets, let's say also with the Igla, then you have 2 infantry cards with Scratchets, so you have plenty of Scratchets on the field. Then a book can do amazing work for you, because it'll deal 9 damage, and a Scratchet very often just deals 1 damage and finishes off the plane, or vice versa. So Bookend 1, very, very strong option. Quite possibly better than what I have. This is just my personal preference. Mortars, none of them are really amazing. Potnos is just standard 3HE mortar. Nona are expensive, don't carry a lot of ammo. Vasilek is expensive and also doesn't carry a lot of ammo, and doesn't have a lot of range either for the price. I think that's all that needs to be said in the AA tab or support tab. You know, lots of choices here. Tunguska can also work if you just want it for the gun, but Tunguska M has an amazing missile, and of course that ridiculous spag. Tanks, once again, like is tradition, I suppose, a lot of choices. For my 1 versus 1 setup, I run the BU, T64BV, T72B, hold up, I run this one updated, T72B, and the T80. In team games, you probably want BU and UM. In 1 versus 1s, either of them will suffice. Technically, you don't really need either of them. Super heavies in general, most decks don't actually require them these days. But especially if you can fit them in, there's still gonna be plenty of situations, depending on your playstyle, where you might still want them. Many people still open with them and use them all the time, so it's really up to you. The T64BV is a nice medium heavy, although it does get double tapped by peace runs with 17 armor. If you don't want that, you can run the OBR89 or even the OBR. Oh no, the OBR87 also does, but OBR89. It's like an HA, but instead of having 9 RPM, you get the sphere missile, and of course you have some worse accuracy and stabilizers. But you're fast, you have good autonomy, you have an autoloader, which is nice. So yeah, and honestly, I think I prefer the OBR now to look at it with all the peace runs running around. T72B is just a solid medium. Always go for the B over the B1. The sphere for 5 points is very good, especially if you go up against other mediums, like 84A for example. The sphere is going to do a lot of damage, 4.5 damage against 15 armor, so nearly a double shot, and at a long range. And if you micro your gun and use the exploit where you turn off your gun after you fire it, and then the sphere fires, and then you turn on your main gun again, you know, that's a bit of an exploit, but what can you do? Also requires micro and isn't universally useful. Yeah, T72A, amazing 55-point tank. Not as strong offensively as a T80, which is just amazing in forests, but it's very good for flanks, for low intensity flanks, sides of the map, where the medium optics, 13 front armor, and like good overall stats, very self-sufficient for the price, can be very, very strong, very useful. Other than that, you know, BV is of course still decent. T80U can be okay, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. None of the T55s or T62s are particularly good, and yeah, OBR87, like I said, can also be decent. But those are really the mainly used tanks for Soviets. Once again, as always in team games, you tend to go heavier into the tanks and not as varied. Recon tab. It can be a bit awkward. Let's go with the starters. I run, I copied this from Putin 187, like a couple of stuff in his deck, or many of the stuff, because I don't play USSR very often. 2 cards of Spetsnaz Screw in the BTR90, amazing combination. It's expensive, but very strong. BTR90, 3 front armor for a wheeled armed transport is very strong. Strong armaments, can fire AGS and autocannon at the same time, so it will melt infantry. Spetsnaz Screw is just a very solid Recon infantry, so that's a very potent combination. Flank defense, offensively in openers for nearly any role. K52 for some helicopter recon as well as helicopter defense. The seat is a nice bonus, but it's not what you buy this for. It's the best anti-air helicopter that Soviets really get, because the Mi-24V is just not particularly good for the price. The stealth massively helps with survivability as well, especially if the enemy helicopters don't have optics of themselves, on their own. BRDM-3 can be good options, but it's not really needed with the BTR-90, but you know, the stealth and especially the optics can still be nice at times. M24K instead of the K52 you can also run. Of course, doesn't fulfill the same role, but still good optics, still fast. What I run as a last card is a card of Razzmann in the MTV, so I have that slot of having a card of MTVs. Just ridiculously strong fire support helicopters. The Razzmann are a nice bonus, but it's really just to get a cheap MTV. Vehicle tab, must have BMPT, incredibly strong unit against any kind of vehicle that isn't really a heavy tank. Against infantry, it melts infantry, good armor, medium optics, it's fast. Can fire AGS and autocannon at the same time. If you're in a forest, you want to turn off that HE gun in the middle because it will prioritize that over the autocannon. And the autocannon has better DPS. But yeah, it's very easy to use, it's very strong, incredibly potent vehicle. As for the second card in the vehicle tab, because I will have these points left over otherwise, I run the SU-122, just some medium range fire support. I rarely call in, but I just don't know what else to put in. You can put in the Shallow, the CPTU, the Afghansky, although I wouldn't recommend it because it just uses crash hits for base defense. Or just, you can also use it in a third helicopter card, as you'll see. But I just don't have the points for a fifth plane, as you'll see in the end. Mi-24VP is just a very solid all-round helicopter against ground units, against helicopters that don't have AA missiles, it'll do well. Infantry vehicles, it'll be a threat to tanks. Super heavies will just shrug them off the front, but it's still 1 damage, so at times, you know, even at the front it can be dangerous for enemy super heavies to go up against this. Just very potent. And of course, important, the gun has a turret, so it can the whole helicopter does not have to turn for the gun to fire. Next up, I run the K50. Mi-28 is probably easier to use, I would say. I just run a K50 because I like it, the way it looks. The AA missiles can be a nice bonus. The gun doesn't have a turret, so the whole helicopter has to turn for it to fire. The VKs fire very fast in salvos of 2, sort of, even though they're semi-active, but the 2 seconds reload time only come into play after firing 2 missiles. But yeah, incredibly fast. Mi-28 is, I would say, just more forgiving and all-round more useful with the gun that is actually usable and these few rocket pods. But, you know, I just prefer the K50. Air tab, lots of choices here. The most awkward thing in the air tab is really ASF. You can run the SU-25T, everyone knows how strong it is. It will require air support though, or control of the air game I should say, as well as just knowing where the enemy AA is. You can't just send it in and, you know, suicide it. Sometimes it might look like it's easy to use, but it's not always the case, especially on more closed maps. And also depending on what decks you go up against. But in the end it can be incredibly potent. SU-27M is just a no-brainer, super heavy deleter, and especially if you already have air superiority or something like that, or the enemy has low AA, it's just incredibly hard to get rid of. Can also go up against enemy ASFs, 50% ECM, veteran, Wimples. Not much can go, you know, can go toe-to-toe with this. Yak 141 can be your medium tier ASF. You can also go for like a double ASF setup with like the PU and the PD, for example, or the Yak and the PD. PD is just, if you want the second card of ASFs, ignoring the 27M, on top of your Yak or whatever you use, the PD can be a good option because it's relatively cheap. It's a bit inconsistent, but you know, you will still just get those lucky crits and just one-shot planes. And if you go up against enemy A10s or 25Ts, those 2 ADG missiles will do wonders. I run Seed, lastly, to protect the 25T. It's a bit ballsy, a bit of a gamble, I guess you could say, because fairly low on the air superiority setup, so I don't have too many units to support the 25T with. And the thing is, as opposed to the K52, you don't need direct line of sight on the enemy radar AA unit to fire the SU-24C. So if it's deep in the forest, the K52 cannot fire at it. What you can also run, of course, is, like I said, you can run the PU. You can even run the MiG-29M. I would definitely go for Elite as like a pseudo 27M as well, you know, backup ASF. It does have medium stealth, which is nice. MiG-27K if you want a cheap tank deleter. PD, like I said, MLD or ML if you want like a cheap Helo Hunter, or DML if you want just a cheap recon plane against like helicopters and stuff like that. 25 PM if you really want to go heavy into seat, and the team games I would go for this over the 24. IL-102 if you want more of those 2 rear armor memes, you know, 2 IL-102s and 2 25Ts if you really want to bully your opponent's AA. Has a good bomb spread as well, but of course is slow and no ECM, so it is still not that hard to get rid of. But if you already have like control over the airspace and the enemy control over the enemy anti-air, as stupid as it sounds, then this thing is just gonna be a pain in the butt. MiG-31M, I wouldn't use it in 1 versus 1s, but if you play a team game and somewhat coordinated team game, one of you having this can be very useful for the air detection and just behind the lines, just getting missiles off every now and then. Not to be underestimated. Not as good as the Tomcat, but I wouldn't say useless in team games. That's really all there is to it. MiG-29S, you know, if you really want a bomber that is also survivable, you can go for it. I wouldn't recommend, just use the Hurricane instead if you wanna try to kill something with HE. And that's Soviets. Like I said, you can do a lot of stuff in here, so my deck looks very different from Putin's deck, and Putin's deck might look very different from someone else's deck, and they might all be very viable. So it depends on your play style, it depends on what you play, team games or 1 versus 1s. So yeah, a lot of stuff you can do here. In any case, I hope I didn't forget anything. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll hopefully see you next time. See ya.